Hi, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Packers Unscripted from Packers.com. I am Mike Spofford, joined by my partner in crime, Weston Hodkowitz. We're coming to you here from our studios at Lambeau Field. Wes, the 2022 NFL Draft is just 2 days away. The first round just 2 days away at the time that we are taping this. How does that hype song go? Y'all ready for this? Like that's how it starts, right? I mean, here we go, right? The Packers enter this 3-day drafting extravaganza with 11 picks, and the eyes are really on the top of this draft for the Packers because Green Bay, as a result of the Davante Adams trade to the Raiders, the Packers have 2 first-round picks, 2 second-round picks. The numbers are 22 and 28 in the first round, 53 and 59 in the second round. This could be a draft unlike one we have seen in Green Bay for quite some time, my friend.
March 18th, 2022, I was walking into Barnes & Noble somewhere in Green Bay. I assume you were getting a foot massage. That's when the reports came out that Davante Adams was going to be traded. And here's the thing, Michael. Since that moment, and since the time in which it was made official, I might have botched it. It might have been March 18th that it was actually made official. March 17th, the report came out. Since the time that was made official, the question has been, so what are the Packers going to do in this draft?
Right.
They have 4 picks in the top 59, the first time since the merger that's ever happened if they end up picking in those spots. They have obvious needs at multiple positions, but maybe not so much so that it's like, okay, well, they have to take a certain player at this spot. But there's so many areas that have made this a compelling draft, from the prospects involved to the fact that it's been 20 years since the Packers have drafted receivers in the first round, the fact they have guys replaced on the offensive line, the defensive line. And that has created this cloud of really questions that we've been seeing in Insider Inbox, that we've seen on Twitter. And everybody has had an opinion on what the Packers should do. Well, Michael, in 2 days' time, at the time in which we're taping this, we will finally get some answers.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. You go back to the moment that Davante Adams was traded, and at that time, and this is interesting when you talk about exactly what are the Packers' needs, right? Because at the time that Adams was traded, if you had said, okay, what are the Packers' biggest needs in this draft, everybody would have said, obviously, wide receiver on the offensive side and defensive line, right? But then as we talked about on our last show, in classic, typical Brian Gutekunst fashion, what does he do between the start of free agency and the draft?
Yep.
He signs Jaron Reed, a veteran, to come in on the defensive line. He signs Sammy Watkins, a veteran, to come in and help out at wide receiver, putting him in a position with all this draft capital at the top of the draft, putting him in a position where he doesn't have to say, all right, on Thursday night, I have to get a receiver, I have to get a defensive lineman, because as we mentioned on our last show, if the Packers had to play a game on May 1st, they have the players to go and play the game, right? Brian Gutekunst is always going to make the draft about the future investment, not necessarily, or he doesn't force himself paint himself into the corner, so to speak, of the draft having to be about the here and now and about week 1 of the upcoming season. So that's where we are. When I look at the Packers' roster needs in this draft, I break them down into sort of 2 tiers. To me, the top tier it's still wide receiver and defensive line, I think, but also offensive tackle and then edge rusher. Yep. Offensive tackle, as we talked about previously, if the Packers go in with David Bakhtiari at left tackle, Yosh Nijman at right tackle, you're still going to need somebody to back up those spots. You want to have a young, developing player who could fill in if injuries were to strike again. Edge rusher, the Packers have Rashawn Gary and Preston Smith. But who do they have after that? There are a lot of question marks, a lot of unproven players. Maybe you draft, invest a high pick in this draft to fortify the edge rusher position. So those are the 4 spots for me that are sort of like the tier 1 of the roster needs. But then also safety, cornerback, inside linebacker, tight end. I think all of those are also in play for the Packers, maybe not necessarily in the first round, but certainly come Friday night starting in the second round, I think those positions come into play. My point is that the way this sets up for Brian Gutekunst at this point, with the 4 picks in the top 60, there, aside from taking a quarterback, a running back, or a specialist, no position drafted within those top 4 picks that he has would necessarily surprise me based on how the Packers are currently constructed.
Because I think what you outlined there is the fact that Green Bay has a certain amount of needs, that I think a lot of that was brought on by the changes this offseason.
Yep.
Devontae Adams trade, Zadarius Smith being released, and not having another guy, another Rashawn Gary kind of handpicked in that role behind.
Billy Turner being released creates the need at offensive
Lucas
tackle.
Patrick going.
Right.
So, I mean, like there are areas where they lost, but by and large, they have depth at all these positions. The way that this roster is fortified, there are bodies at all these positions. Cornerback, you have 3 guys you put up probably against anybody. Safety, Adrian Amos, Darnell Savage are going to be together for their 4th straight year. That rarely happens in the NFL. So from that perspective, it is about building depth. But what makes it so compelling is the fact that there are 5 picks in the first 2 days that Green Bay is slated to make right now. There are 4 picks in the top 59 that they are slated to make. And we saw what happened in 2019 when Green Bay had 2 picks. And the ways in which Brian Gutekunst can move around depending on how the board falls. Somebody's going to fall, Mike. One of these receivers, maybe one of the edge rushers, maybe a safety. We've even seen, maybe an inside linebacker.
Maybe even a defensive lineman, just because you just don't know. That this draft feels as unpredictable as any that we've entered in a long time.
And it's not because, that player isn't good enough. It's because I think there really is a wide array of talent that's all kind of pretty much the same outside of that top 6 or 7 players. Then the real question also becomes how many quarterbacks get taken before the Packers go on the board at 22. There aren't going to be as many as these past few years, but those quarterback spots ultimately are the ones that end up leading to a skill position player falling or a defensive lineman falling. Again, enhancing the options for the Packers once they go on the board.
Yeah. Well, in talking about some of these positions of need, and we will just have to see how the draft falls. And also, with regard to Gutekunst and his options, with the draft capital that he has, I mean, he could move up, he could move down, he could do both within both Thursday night and Friday night. There's no way of knowing exactly how this is going to go. But with regard to the wide receiver position, that's the one everybody wants to talk about. Is there a guy or guys that might have struck your fancy here as this draft has gotten closer?
The cool thing is, Mike, the more you dive into it, the more you like basically all these options in the top 50. Because every single one of them offers something different. If you want a 6-foot guy like Chris Olave that isn't your typical type of receiver that Green Bay has drafted, or, a Christian Watson. You have the George Pickens kid that, everyone knows about, guys that have a little bit more size. You're the one, and I've joked about it, but it's actually true, you're the one that drove the Treylon Burks, train. And that whistle caught my attention too. Because the more you see this kid and the more you realize what he did at Arkansas and how they turned things around this season, he seems more and more to me like a Green Bay Packer type player. The question is whether or not he's there at 22.
Right.
And the thing that's going to have to get decided before the Packers probably are even remotely on near the clock is Jameson Williams. Is a team willing to take him with the ACL concerns? Does he go 10? As some people have mocked him to the Jets.
Yeah, it's funny because when he tore the ACL in the national championship game, and in the early stages after that, it was like, oh, maybe Jameson Williams, will be there at the top of the second round for somebody, and then it was like, oh, well, yeah, these teams at the bottom of the first round, the Packers have these 2 picks. They have a need at wide receiver. Maybe they would take Jameson Williams, even though he wouldn't obviously be ready to go right away as a rookie. The more time has gone on, the more Jameson Williams has climbed up to the spot, or at least much closer to the spot in the draft where he would be getting picked if he had never gotten hurt. I think the question is, he's probably not going to be the first receiver off the board, which he most likely would be if he hadn't gotten hurt. But it sure doesn't sound like he's going to last much past maybe the 14th or 15th pick or something like that.
That'd be
Whereas
stuck.
a couple of months ago, there was a whole different narrative with regard to where Jamison Williams might be available.
So the question naturally becomes, where does Williams fall? I think Drake London and Wilson will both be off the board by they get to that point. I just feel the reason I bring up Williams is I feel like that's going to be the one that really decides how far Burks falls.
Yeah.
Because I think once that wave starts with the receivers, I think that's going to carry through a little bit. And then you look a little bit farther down, I really love the Sky Moore kid, in addition to having a fantastic name. You know, there's some questions about with him and Watson, the competition involved in that. But certainly I think he's another guy. Doesn't have the traditional size Green Bay looks for, but I love the way he performed. They've had success in the past, obviously, with Western Michigan recruits. And then I just got to give the shout out to the kid, Alec Pierce from Cincinnati. He's probably going to end up being a day 2, 3-ish type pick out of Cincinnati. But one, he has the common bond there with Matt LaFleur. There's a lot of connections on that Cincinnati staff to LaFleur. They've already dipped into that well before with Josiah DeGuara. But the kid loves the Packers. So, I mean, you can't ever go wrong with a guy that, I think he grew up in whatever it was, Illinois, but yet he grew up a Packers fan. Just a remarkable backstory in addition to the fact that he has some of those type of attributes that Green Bay likes.
Yeah, it's interesting. For those who have been following the our Prospect Primer series that we've been doing for the past month on the website, and obviously if you've been following Inbox, I've said, and I'm not saying this as a scout, as a talent evaluator, I'm just talking as the interested observer, right, who looks into these things a little bit. The two receivers in this draft that, for whatever reason, they've struck my fancy, as I like to say, are Treylon Burks from Arkansas and Christian Watson from North Dakota State. I like the bigger receivers. Burks is 6'2", 225, yet at 225 he ran a 4.55 in the 40. Now, yes, he's not a 4.3 burner like a Chris Olave or a Garrett
But that's
Wilson,
not the way they've done things here either over the years.
Right, but at 225 pounds, a 4.55 is not exactly slow.
No.
Christian Watson, 6'4", 208 pounds. Now, he did run in the 4.3s, so this is a taller guy, rangier guy who also does have the speed. What I'm curious about, though, as you mentioned with Burks, will he be there at 22, or is he going to go sooner than that? I think that could certainly go either way. With Watson, I start to wonder, the more I read about it, is drafting him in the first round a little bit too rich?
Yeah.
But then with the Packers not picking until 53, 59 in the second round, is he going to be there at the end of the second round? I think that becomes a big question mark. Because it seems that he's maybe a bottom of the first round guy, but more likely a top half of the second round guy, and then he's not there in the 50s if the Packers are waiting for him to drop that far.
Do you know who he reminds me of? Not from a makeup standpoint. This reminds me of Jordy Nelson, because if they get him at 22 or 28, I'm not saying I think he's gonna be a good pro, but you wonder about the value. The Packers had, with those 2 second-round picks, I mean, with the math I was doing, with all these picks they have, Brian Gutekunst, depending, regardless of what happens on Thursday night, he can do anything he wants in the second round. They can go up into the top 3 of the second round if they want to, with pairing up some of these picks. That's where it gets interesting with me with Watson. If that's a guy that you can take at 35 or 36, I really like that value. And it's not to take anything away. NDSU is one of the preeminent powers in that division of football. They've won how many national championships over the last 20 years? But that's the only thing holding me back from it. It's just this game is different, and playing at that level and creating separation is different. It's when you have options like Burks, when you have options like Pickens, these guys have played in the SEC. They've seen the very best that college football has to offer. That's why, to me,
a lot of DBs who are going to have their names called this weekend. Yeah, no, I hear you. I hear exactly.
But I love him too. He has everything. He's how you draw it up if you were creating a player on Madden.
Yeah,
he has everything you want in a receiver.
It's funny though that you mentioned Jordy Nelson, pick 36 from 2008, and it's funny that you would mention that, because for all this talk about are the Packers going to draft a wide receiver in the first round for the first time since 2002 with Javon Walker. Packers have had such a great track record of success with second round draft picks: Jordy Nelson, Devontae Adams, Greg Jennings, Randall Cobb, right? Who was the highest pick of those second rounders was Jordy Nelson at 36, and almost I don't know whether you'd want to call it the big coincidence or the big irony or whatever, but if Brian Gutekunst trades to the 36th spot to take a wide receiver, that would almost like put a bow on this entire discussion we've been having.
It really would.
For the entire offseason. Before we get to some other positions, I do want to take care of our sponsor business. Sirius XM NFL Radio delivers hard-hitting analysis and up-to-the-minute NFL news that true football fanatics need 24/7, 365. And at Cousin Subs, we have something for everyone, like our Wisconsin cheese curds, mac and cheese, golden fries, and creamy shakes, all paired with your favorite sub or sub in a bowl. Cousin Subs, we believe in better. All right, I want to get some of your thoughts, Wes, on guys you've looked at or you're curious about, both on the defensive line and at the edge rusher spot. Because I know in discussions that we've had, a guy that I really like on the defensive line, though again I don't know if he's going to be there, is Devontae Wyatt from Georgia. There are these three guys on that defensive front from Georgia. Trayvon Walker's being talked about as possibly the number one overall pick now, ahead of both Thibodeau and Hutchinson, the edge rushers from Oregon and Michigan, respectively. So Trayvon Walker might go number one. There's Jordan Davis, the 340-pound, run-stuffing nose tackle who ran a sub 4.8 40 at 340 pounds at the combine, which was stunning. But with Wyatt's 304 pounds. He's not a small guy, and yet his 40 time was very similar to Jordan Davis. Now running a 4.77 40 at 304 pounds is no easy trick. So he's a guy that I've had my eye on. But again, will he be there at 22 for the Packers to be able to jump on him? I don't know. Another one that I did a prospect primer on, Travis Jones from UConn, 6'4", 325 pounds. UConn, again, there's that competition level, and this is a guy that's maybe being talked about more in the second round, but will he last all the way towards the end of the second round? It's really hard to say. But yet at the Senior Bowl, the offensive linemen at the Senior Bowl voted him the toughest guy that they faced in the drills all week long. So that says something about, the pedigree that he has, even with all the questions about him coming from UConn as opposed to a Power 5 conference. So those two guys, Devontae Wyatt, Travis Jones, those are two that I have my eye on the defensive line.
It's actually Travis Jones is the one that started to make me look more into the defensive line and kind of shifted my thought to that seems like that's a position they could potentially take on day two. That's a position that maybe in the second round. And trust me, man, every position is a gamble. It's a big gamble once you start to move back on defensive linemen because you're starting to lose some of the attributes that you're looking for in three down players, your Kenny Clarks of the world. That's why in my mind, Jordan Davis won't be there, so it really has centered on Wyatt. And if Wyatt is there at 22 or 28, if they want to take him there, I see a lot of those carryover type attributes with Wyatt that we saw in Kenny Clark in 16.
Yep, that's kind of where I am.
And the transition that they've made during that time with their defensive lineman, he seems to fit the bill a little bit more for what Green Bay is looking for. If Wyatt's there, I like that pick. I like his pedigree. I like what they'd accomplished at Georgia last year. And then if he's not, then there's right now Mike? CBS Sports has 8-9 different guys that could be on day two at that position. Looking at edge is where I fell in love with George Karlaftis.
Yeah, you've been talking about the Purdue edge rusher for a while now.
I've missed on some of these guys. These guys that have unique backstories on the defensive line. It's not always cut and dry here. You're taking a little bit of a risk with Karlaftis and what he's going to be able to provide at the next level. Certainly, you were the first one to point out to me last year at Purdue, once the adjustments were made, then his production kind of dipped a little bit when teams started ISOing on him a little bit. But what do we always talk about? We talk about when you're at the end of the first round, you are looking for 8 to 10 year NFL football players with a Pro Bowl type ceiling, but maybe not guaranteed. Karlaftis checks that box for me because as much as you want Preston Smith to play 80% of the snaps, and as much as I thought Rashawn Gary last year showed that he can handle a full starting complement of reps, they need someone to round out that rotation.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Karlaftis, the first report I read on him, I wish I could remember who did it because it was a great scouting report. They drew the comparison to Ryan Kerrigan, and I see that in him. You wish he was just maybe an inch or two taller. You wish he had maybe a year or two more experience at playing defense. He's a guy that came over with his mom. His dad passes away and starts playing football at a late age. But my goodness, when you turn on the film of him at Purdue, and you and I even talked about it, how often has there been an elite Purdue edge rusher that we can recall? There haven't been a lot of them.
Yeah.
There's just so much to like about the kid, and the Packers do have a need there at edge rusher. To me, now that Jaron Reed is in a Packers uniform, maybe even more so than on the defensive line.
Yeah, and when you look at the film on Karlaftis, as much as as you mentioned in our previous discussion about how, yes, his production dropped off his last year at Purdue, but the guy was double teamed and triple teamed because he was the one guy on the Purdue defense that everybody game planned for. And let's be honest, it was the Purdue defense. There wasn't a whole lot for other Big Ten offenses to have to worry about. And yet, in the midst of all that, George Karlaftis was still a high-impact player because of the way teams had to try to deal with him. And that's what's on the film. And that's why, even though he didn't have that final year in college with 15, 17 sacks or whatever, that he's still being talked about very much as a first-round pick, and a guy that, again, I've seen projections where maybe he goes in the top 15, other projections where he's there not only at 22, but maybe even at 28 towards the end of the first round if the Packers are so inclined in that respect. Another guy similarly that I've seen projected kind of all over the board, a little bit higher maybe than Karlaftis, but when I started doing the prospect primers and looking at guys who back in March were being projected as back half of the first round, Jermaine Johnson, the edge rusher from Florida State, it was there were all sorts of places where he was being slotted anywhere from 16 down to 25 or 27, something like that. But now all of a sudden, as we've gotten closer to the draft, it seems like Jermaine Johnson is being talked about more as a top 15, if not even a top 12 pick in this draft. And as much as I think Brian Gutekunst certainly has the ability to move around and to move up if he wants to, I'm not sure if I see Gutekunst, if he does make a move up in the first round, I'm not sure if I see him making a move up, say, into the top 12. Like, to me, the first dozen picks I think are going to go by, and I don't really see the Packers getting all that involved. But once you get to pick like 13 or 14 or 15, if Gutekunst has his eye on somebody who's still there, who's not picked in the top 12, that's where I could see the phones really start to buzz and say, hey, okay, what's it going to cost? What's it worth to go up and get this guy? And I'm not saying that they would make that move for Jermaine Johnson. It could be for a wide receiver. It could be for a defensive lineman, whatever. But again, it's a position that the Packers have to start not only having that rotation, as you mentioned, for now, but also looking toward the future. You'd love to get the next Rashawn Gary in this draft if you can, right?
Yeah, and I think the point you're making there that I think is really astute is that that's where it's going to get really interesting of what's on the board at 15, 16.
Yes.
The spots where it's not going to take a lot to potentially move up, or compared to trying to get into the top 12.
Right. Where if Gutekunst wants to move up, he doesn't have to give up the second first round pick. It's more of like, okay, I'm going to trade one of the second rounders to move up a half dozen spots or something like that.
And Johnson's a guy, Mike, I completely wrote him off in terms of what we were looking at as far as the Packers potentially drafting, just because I didn't think he'd be there. And he may not even be anywhere close to 22. But ACC Defensive Player of the Year, 12 sacks last season. Kid was born, he's born from Minnesota. I mean, Eden Prairie. I mean, he has the local ties there too. And that's where this is going to get interesting, because now the Packers have to start weighing guys that could be a Rashawn Gary, where it's like he may not start right away. He may not play 500 snaps right away.
Right.
But look at what that investment in Gary 3 years ago has done for them now, with having to move on from Zadarius Smith because of the back and the money. And now you have a guy that I think you feel really good about going into the season with, compared to, okay, we need to have a receiver in this room. That's where the questions start to come up a little bit.
Yeah. The other one I think at edge rusher that's going to be interesting to see what happens is David Ojabo, if I'm saying the last name correctly, the guy from Michigan who unfortunately blew out his Achilles on Michigan's pro day. And that's obviously going to damage his draft stock. But then the question is, how far does he fall? Maybe somebody still takes him late in the first round. maybe he's still there all the way late in the second round where the Packers would go, okay, yeah, we're not going to be able to expect much because of that injury, here as a rookie, but but is this guy worth, that it's not quite the same injury situation as Jamison Williams at wide receiver that we talked about, but yet there's some similarity in that there's so much uncertainty as to how teams are going to value a player like that if there were a completely clean bill of health, the player's being valued here, but because of the health questions, there are all sorts of different opinions as to exactly what it's worth in this draft to get that guy.
And so many times, Mike, it really does seem like when you have an elite prospect that is coming off a devastating injury, more often than not, they're able to make it back. I think back to Miles Jack, with Jacksonville a number of years ago, where people were like, they weren't sure if this kid's going to be able to play in the NFL based on that injury he had, and then there he was. I mean, obviously Jalen Smith went through that. Willis McGahee at the running back position. Those things do happen.
Yeah.
The thing that's different about this young man that I feel for him is the pro day aspect of it. You're seeing these videos already at Williams. I mean, he's already running and cutting and all ththese things because he's so far out now, 3-4 months out. And then it's different when it happens at a pro day because now it really does legitimately throw the rookie year into question.
Yeah, it's right up against the draft as opposed to an injury from January.
And this is completely unfair to him, but it's weird that we've actually gotten to the point now where a receiver tears his ACL, and it's not really a huge deal breaker for me anymore. You feel like they can make it back from that. There's something about that darn Achilles, though, that always kind of makes my stomach rumble.
Yep.
Just because you're never too quite sure, because it's not just about them coming back. It's what is it taking out of the explosivity of the athlete. And that's one thing, too, you got to kind of monitor. That's a pretty devastating injury, in addition from the pain aspect, but also the rehab.
Yeah. Well, before we go, I want to get your thoughts on any names regarding offensive linemen, specifically offensive tackles.
Could go forever on this one.
Yeah, because I think that's certainly a position the Packers are going to be looking very, very strongly at. We were talking before we turned the cameras on about the Central Michigan Bernhard Raimann.
Yep.
Yeah, hopefully I'm saying that correctly. Originally from Austria, comes over to the United States as a foreign exchange student originally, if I'm not mistaken. Ends up taking up football, goes back to his home country, but then comes back to America to play college football. Starts out as a tight end, gets converted from tight end to offensive tackle, and the question with this young man is because of his background and just how things developed and converting from tight end, there's a lot of excitement as to just how good he might be because he's barely getting started, right? But now we're also hearing some things just as the draft is approaching that there might be something that popped up on a medical scan or something like that. So just where this offensive tackle from Central Michigan is going to go and how teams are valuing him, I think is going to be interesting to watch.
Yeah, and I love that aspect of the tight end position because I think there's a lot to be said for that. You're seeing that more and more too, specifically in these kind of situations, not with the foreign exchange, but in terms of a MAC school, that they get a guy, they feel really good about him as an athlete, they get him in there, and it's like, okay, well, maybe this guy could be, the way he's developing, maybe he could be an offensive lineman. And I like what that tight end position sometimes teaches those kids, because it happens a lot, more than you think, in terms of guys that end up making that switch. Certainly, again, we have to see, it just came out, and I don't know how credible the reporting is on it, but it's another thing. It's these things that'll kind of pop up during the week. These
things that pop up in the last 48, 72 hours before the draft that it's like you wonder, okay, is there some truth to it? Is it just something completely off the mark? Is it maybe not as bad as it's being reported? Like, we really don't know. But with regard to the Packers, we know the first 3 or 4 offensive tackles in this draft are going to get taken very, very high. They aren't really in range for the Packers unless Brian Gutekunst decides to make a major move. So those guys are projected to go in the top 8, 9, 10 picks of this draft. But there is a group of offensive tackles that expected to be available in the back half of the first round. I think Raimann is one of them. Tyler Smith from Tulsa is another one. I was talking to Larry about him because Larry did the Prospect Primer video on him, and Tyler Smith, 6'5", 324 pounds. He just turned 21 years old. Larry described him as a mauler. He's an absolute mauler of an offensive lineman, but incredibly raw. Green as grass, as they say, as far as the technique, the refinement, the pass blocking part of things. So a really intriguing prospect there, who's probably going to be available in the latter half of the first round. But again, a 21-year-old that just how high is the ceiling, and that's what the scouts get paid for, right? To try to figure out how much these guys are potentially worth.
And it's weird because you look at those guys up front, a lot of SEC kids, some Big Ten kids. It's these guys in the back that it's just their backgrounds are all over the place. I mean, you talk about Smith being from Tulsa, Trevor Penning, the big kid from Northern
Iowa. Yeah.
If you would put him on Iowa, not Northern Iowa, no disrespect to Northern Iowa, great school, but I'd be like, this is the Packers type of pick. When you look at his pedigree, his background, what he played in college, the level at which he played it, and the size, Mike, 6'7", 320 pounds. Everything you look for. I don't know how this kid ended up over there at an FCS school. I love everything about him. And then my favorite, and I think you even know who I'm going to say here, Daniel Falele from Minnesota. 6'8", 385 pounds. I mean, they just don't build humans like this. But it's one thing to be that big. It's another thing to be able to play to that weight. Now, Minnesota kept him on the right side. I think that's where he's going to end up here in the pros. And maybe, there's some stuff, conditioning-wise, depending on which direction they want to go. But he's a guy that you think you see a guy that big and you're thinking, okay, you're just going to be able to speed past this kid. He knows how to move within his body. And being able to play at Minnesota and seeing Big Ten competition, I'm really excited about this kid. And to me, when you asked me to start looking through the offensive linemen and start getting my names together, for guys that could potentially be there at the end of the first round, he's one of the ones I'm most excited about, just because I think that ceiling with him and potentially what he could become is really special.
Yeah, seems like there's, heading into this draft, the wide receiver position seems fairly deep, which is how it's been for a few years now. Seems like there's maybe a little more depth at the defensive line position than we've seen in recent drafts, and you don't often see offensive tackles, quality first-round offensive tackles, last until the latter stages of the first round. But I think some of them in this draft are going to be there. This is a really intriguing draft for the big guys, and I think the Packers have a need to stock up a little bit on both sides with regard to the big guys.
And that's going to be the interesting thing, to see how these dominoes fall. The Packers are picking 11 times in this draft. I think the most picks that they have set up for, going back to maybe 2013. There are a number of different areas they can address, but there's also a lot of flexibility too. When you have 2 firsts, 2 seconds, the third, the fourths. The only time they're not picking right now is the 6th round. Oh, and on the other side of it, they have 3 in the 7th.
3 in the 7th. Yeah.
So the amount of flexibility that Brian is going to have in this draft is unequal to anything he's seen, including when he had the 2 firsts in 2019. So that's why I think that the 3 days, especially depending on what happens on night 1, it's going to be as edge of the seat as it gets for NFL Packers drafts, because really anything outside of the top 10 is in play. Yep. Depending on how they want to partner those picks, if they want to move around a little bit. Oh, and then, by the way, now veteran A, B, and C is being potentially attached to Green Bay too. Could there be a trade on that aspect of it? Get your popcorn ready, folks. It is going to be a wild 3 days.
Absolutely. And with that, we will call it a wrap on this edition of Packers Unscripted. Be sure to follow all of our coverage of the team, all of our coverage of the draft. We've got everything for you: Thursday, Friday, Saturday, stories, videos, commentary, all of it. Instant reactions. If you want to be following the draft live, stay on our website. Wes and Larry and I are going to be talking about these picks as soon as they're made. We're going to have it all for you on Packers.com. For Wes, I'm Mike. Thank you for tuning in, everybody. We'll see you next time.